Okay, good morning, class. Now, today, what we are going to do is we are going to start with the third part of research methodology, and let's start with it today and let's move ahead. Okay, so when we talk of the the topics that we are covering, we are basically talking today about the various data collection tools that we have, which is both primary and secondary, right? And so all of this would be covered, right? So we start with introduction as to what is data collection. Well, data collection, when we say, it's a process of collecting, measuring, as well as analyzing information, right? Why? For our looking for answers to the questions that our research or project seeks to resolve, right? And these information that you collect, it could be collected either through primary as primary data, that is for intended studies, or for when you collect information for when you're actually doing it. There's no prior information when you're collecting information for the first time, right? So what happens is and that's called primary data. The other is like when you're using the information which is collected by someone else, right? And you're using, that's called secondary data. Okay, so whichever method you use, but these are main purpose is to collect the information that you need for your research or your projects. So in other words, when we talk about information, so it's information which is used to answer research questions or resolve project issues, can either come from primary sources or secondary sources, right? And the choice of the data source will depend on your research. This is important, on your research questions, the project that you undertake, the nature of the study, and the availability of study. Okay, so let's go into primary and secondary data. Primary data is what is we know these are the data which is collected for the first time, and thus happens to be original in character, right? And data that are observed or collected by researcher are originally for research. That's called primary data. Well, on the other hand, when we talk of secondary data, this is all those data which are which has been already collected by someone else, and which has already been passed through the statistical process. So we're just referring to it. We are using someone else's data. Our secondary data is always the primary data for someone else. Someone else has collected it. So this is the basic difference between a primary data and a secondary data. So we'll start with the first comes the meaning. Well, we know primary data is collected. I just said it's a first-hand experience, and this is the information that you gather for the purpose of a particular research project. Secondary data, on the other hand, is the data that is already collected by someone else for some other purpose, right? So it's not for our purpose, someone else's purpose. Main sources of primary data are interviews, surveys, questionnaires, field observation, experiments, action research, case studies, and so on and so forth. Whereas for secondary data, it is the previous research, mass media products, government reports, official statistics, web information, historical data, and so on and so forth. Data time, it's for primary data, it's real-time data because you're collecting it by yourself actually, whereas for secondary data, it is past data. Specific to the researcher needs. It's for primary data, it's always specific to your needs, but secondary data, most cases, it is not specific to our needs. It's cost-wise, primary data collection is more expensive as compared to secondary data, which at times it is also free. The level of control over the data quality, it's quite high in case of primary data, but in case of secondary, there is lack of control over the data quality. Time consuming, primary data collection is more time consuming as compared to secondary data. Proprietary information, in case of primary data, we are the owner of the data because we've collected, and the information can remain hidden from the competitors. But for secondary data, we are not the owner, and our competitors can also have an access to that data. Capability, primary data, it's more capable to solve a specific problem because we are collecting it for our purpose. Whereas for secondary data, it's less capable to solve a specific problem because it has not been collected for our purpose. It was collected for someone else's purpose. So the advantage of primary data, it's specific to the needs of the researcher. And at the moment of data collection, the researcher has the control of the kind of data that needs to be collected. It's accurate as compared to secondary data. It's not subjected to any personal bias, and as such, the authenticity can be trusted. And the researcher exhibits ownership of the data. When you collect when you actually collect that data through primary research, and he or she may choose it to make it available to publicly, may patent it or even sell it. It's usually up to date, the data, and because it is collected in real time, right? And the researcher has full control over the data collected through primary research. He can decide which design, method, and data analysis techniques to be used. But what can be the challenge? It's expensive as compared to secondary data, so it's very difficult to collect primary data. It's time consuming, and it may not be feasible to collect primary data in some cases where there is complexity and requires more commitment. So, what are the various tools to collect primary data? First is the interview method. What is it? It involves presentation of oral verbal stimuli and reply in terms of oral verbal responses. And this can be used through either through personal interviews and sometimes through telephonic interviews. So we'll go into personal interview. Personal interview, it requires a person known as the interviewer, that is yourself, asking questions, generally face-to-face contact with the other person or persons, right? And personal interview can be again two types. It could be direct personal investigation or it could be indirect oral investigation. So in case of direct personal investigation, what happens is the interviewer collects the information personally from all the real sources concerned, right? And this method is actually suitable for intensive investigations when you have to do an intensive investigation. On the other hand, when we talk of indirect oral examination, so there the interviewer has to cross-examine other persons who are supposed to have the knowledge about the problem, who are experts, right? And the information obtained is recorded. All right. So whichever may be the type of interview, it could be, there are three ways. Either it could be structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. Now, structured interviews, these are in all those interviews which are based on a predetermined and standardized set of questions. You already know what questions to ask. It's already decided before you go and actually start interviewing the person. So such sort of questions are also called interviewer administered questions, questionnaires, right? So since structured interviews can generate quantifiable facts, so hence they are also known as quantitative research interviews, which is used mostly in descriptive studies. Now, semi-structured interviews, this is where the interviewer will have a list of questions that they want to ask, but if needed, they can skip certain questions and also can ask questions beyond the list, that list of questions that has been designed before, to be in order to explore more on the subject, right? And the interviewer can use audio recording or key note-taking strategy to record the data. It's explanatory, used in explanatory study. In case of unstructured interviews, which is also known as in-depth interviews, because the discussion is held without any list of guidelines. So it's much more informal. It's informal. It's, let's say it's not much more, but it's fully informal. And the interviewer will actually explore in-depth information, right? But which is why it's time consuming and maybe difficult to manage. And so it's used in explanatory as well as explorative study. So interview, it's an, as we know, it's a more appropriate for research, for collecting data through interviews under certain circumstances. For especially when you do a research, it's more appropriate for any research work when you have to collect data, right, through interviews. But then there are when can you use it? But there are certain conditions. First, when you wish to gather very detailed information, you anticipate wanting to ask respondents for more information about the responses. You want some more details, so you will have to have one-to-one interaction. You plan to ask questions that require lengthy explanation, so it's much better to have a talk, front face-to-face talk. The topic that you are studying is complex or maybe confusing to the respondents, so it's better to have a one-to-one interaction. And sometimes your topic also involves studying processes. So these are the areas, these are the conditions, some of the conditions where you want to go for an interview method. Okay, but you should ensure certain things. That is, the interviewer should be, you as an interviewer should create friendly atmosphere of trust and confidence, so that the respondents may feel at ease while talking and discussing with you, right? You should ask questions properly and intelligently, and must record the responses correctly and completely, right? So you must also answer legitimate questions in case if they are asked by your respondent, right? If they ask you questions, ask answer legitimate questions, which is very much legitimate and related to your subject, and must clear any doubt. If the respondent has any doubt, clarifications you must do it. The approach that you should be taking should be friendly, courteous, conversational, and unbiased. Should not show any surprise or disapproval of the respondent's answer, but he must keep the direction of the interview. He here is the interviewer. You must keep the direction of the interview in your own hand. You should direct the interview, right? Discouraging any sort of irrelevant conversation, and also must take all possible effort to ensure that your respondent is on the track. Some of the tips for effective research interviews: make sure that the research question is clear, develop a checklist of the questions to be asked during interview, express clearly the purpose of the interview, start with neutral question to facilitate free flow of information, use open-ended questions so that the respondents can choose their answer, limit the content of each question with a single idea in order to avoid confusion, reduce questions that gives responses of yes and no, because that's limited information. Do not try to influence your respondents by asking leading questions. If you have not understood the response, please ask your respondent to repeat and clarify. Do not assume answers and do not pass any judgments. Avoid irrelevant discussions. So you need to be on track. And when you change your track, please inform your respondents that you're doing so. Keep the interview short, right? Because otherwise, what happens at some point, your respondent would also get, time is a constraint, and they would also get irritated, and they may not answer all your questions. And at the end of the interview, summarize the points that has been told to you by the respondent, and ask the respondent if the summary is correct. So you need to cross check. So interview skills, when you go for interview, the interviewing skills that you need is the questioning. You need to know how to question, recognizing and dealing with difficult participants, right? You have to know everyone will not be the same. Recording interview data, and that interview can be collected through telephones or using other online platforms, right? So this is where I just said. So I just spoke about a personal interview. So just a quick recap, where personal interview method requires a person known as the interviewer to ask questions, usually face to face to the other person or persons. Just said that, right? And it could be either a direct personal investigation, or it could be an indirect oral investigation, right? Okay, so this is just we said a while ago, a quick recap. Right. So, and whatever way of doing personal interviews, it could be either a structured way, where we had a structured questionnaire, or it could be semi structured, where you ask some questions on your own, or it could be unstructured, right? Where it's totally an informal discussion happening. Right. So interview could also be a focused interview, which is basically when meant to focus attention on the given experience of the respondents and its effects. Right. And here what happens, you as have an interviewer, you have the freedom to decide the manner and the sequence in which the questions would be asked, and also the freedom to explore reasons and motives. The main task here is to confine the respondent to a discussion of issues with which he seeks convergence, right? And it's generally used in the development of hypotheses, and it constitutes a major part of unstructured interviews. Clinical interview is concerned with broad underlying feelings or motivations with the course of individual's life experience. So it's more of talking about a person's life experience, what the person has experienced, and from their experience they are giving their opinions. So here, which is here in this case, so what has happened is it's the method of eliciting information. How would you get the information? It's generally left to the interviewer's discretion. In case of non-directive interview, what happens is the interviewer's main role is simply to encourage the respondent to talk about a topic with a bare minimum of direct questioning, right? So where the interviewer acts as a catalyst to a comprehensive expression of the respondent's feelings and beliefs, and of the frame of reference within which such feelings and beliefs can take on personal significance. So just act as a catalyst and encourage your respondent to talk. Okay, so what are the merits of interview method? It's more information, you can get more information and in depth, right? So interviewer through their own skill can overcome the resistance, if resistance from the respondents, and the interview can be made to yield an almost perfect sample of the general population. There is greater flexibility because there is opportunity to restructure questions, right? Especially where you talk of unstructured interviews. And observation method can well be applied to recording verbal answers to various questions. Personal information can well be obtained easily in this method. Samples can be controlled more effectively because there does not arise any difficulty of the missing returns. Non-response generally remains very low because you're having one-to-one interaction, right? You have totally control. You as an interviewer, you can usually control which person will answer questions, which is not possible in case of mailed questionnaire, right? So if needed, group discussion can also be held. You as an interviewer can catch your respondent off guard and secure the more spontaneous reactions that than would be the case if you are actually sending mailing questionnaires, so you do not get to know the reactions. The language of the interview can be adapted to the ability or the educational level of the person interviewed. If it's a person who is illiterate, then the way you talk has to be more simple so that the person can understand as compared to an intellectual person. Right. Interviewer can collect supplementary information about the respondent's personal characteristics and the environment, which is often of great value in interpreting the results. Right. But what are the drawbacks of interviews when we talk of? It's a very expensive method, especially when large and widely spread geographical sample is taken. So there remains the possibility of bias of the interviewer as well as that of a respondent, right? So there is the additional factor of supervision and control of interviewers, right? So certain types of respondents, especially when we talk of officials, important officials and executives, people of high income groups may not be easily approachable in this method. So that and to what happens in that case, the data may prove inadequate. It's more time consuming when you have a large sample size, and and it actually recalls upon the respondents are necessary when you have to talk to your respondents and take their feedback, right? So then it becomes really difficult. The presence of the interviewer on spot may overstimulate the respondent, like they start thinking, imagining things, get overexcited, and starts give you imaginary information to make the interview look interesting. They do it happens. What also happens in this method, the organization required for selecting, training, and supervising the field staff is more complex with some formidable problems. Interview at times may also introduce systematic errors. Effective interview, it presupposes proper rapport with respondents. Yes, you need to have a good rapport, then only would they open up. That would facilitate free and frank responses, which is often a very difficult requirement. It may not be possible, especially if you're talking to, say, executive level people. So having a good rapport may not be possible. Telephonic interviews, right? It's a method of collecting information, consists in contacting respondents on the telephone itself, right? It's and It's not a very widely used method, but plays an important part in the industrial surveys, especially in developed regions. So what are the merits? It's more flexible in comparison to mailing method. It is faster than other method, where you get it's a quick way of obtaining information. It's much cheaper than personal interview method because the cost per response is relatively low. Recall is easy. Callbacks are simple and economical. There's a higher rate of response than we have in mailing method. Non-response is generally low. Replies can be recorded without causing embarrassment to the respondents because they don't see that you're recording it. An interviewer can explain requirements in more easily. At times, what happens? Access to certain respondents is easy, who otherwise could not be contacted in person, say executive level people. There's no need for field staff, and representative and wider distribution of sample is possible. But there are some demerits also. It's where you have, first thing is this little time is given to respondents for considered answers. Interview period is not likely to exceed more than 5 minutes, right? Surveys are restricted to respondents who have telephone facilities. Extensive geographical coverage may get restricted due to cost. It is not suitable for intensive surveys where comprehensive answers are required. Over phone, it's very difficult. Possibility of bias of the interviewer is there's high chance, and questions have to be short and to the point. Probing more into those areas is difficult, right? So some of the guidelines for successful interview, right? Interviewer must plan in advance and should know the problem under consideration. Interviewer's approach should be friendly and informal. All possible efforts should be made to develop a good rapport with the interviewee. Interviewer must know that ability to listen with understanding, respect, with curiosity is the gateway to communication, right? So have to be patient, have to learn to listen. And to the extent possible, there should be free-flowing interview, and the questions must be well phrased in order to have full cooperation with the interviewee. In case of big inquiries, where the task is basically of collecting information through several by several interviewers, so there has to be an interview guide which has to be observed by every member of that group of group of interviewers to ensure that there is uniformity in the way it's been done, right? So that has to be taken into consideration. So if you see these videos, it talks of how to frame interview questions, how to conduct a interview. Now the next comes up is collecting data through survey, or as we say, questionnaire. It's quite popular, especially in case of big inquiries. What happens? A questionnaire is sent, usually by post, to the persons concerned with a request to answer the questions and return it back to the interviewer. Right, so it consists of a number of questions printed or typed in a definite order on a form or set of forms, and which is mailed to the respondents who are expected to read and understand the questions and write down the reply in the space that is given. Then and the respondents have to answer the questions on their own. There won't be anyone to interpret or guide them. And survey involves also use of questionnaires for data collection to study a specific problem in an organization. And each respondent are asked the same set of questions to develop a theory and provide a relevant solution to a problem. Now, there can be two types of questionnaire. One is self-administered questionnaire, where the researchers use different medium such as internet, postal, delivery by hand to collect data. That's a self-administered questionnaire, that is SAQ. It refers to a questionnaire that has been designed specifically to be completed by a respondent without the intervention of the researcher. This is very important, right? When they are collecting the data. Right. So what happens is usually the traditional method is to distribute through mail or in persons, but today we also have it's done through web surveys, right? And because SAQ is completed without ongoing feedback from a trained interviewer, so there has to be special care has to be taken as to how the questions are framed as well as they are formatted in order to avoid any sort of errors. On the other hand, we have interviewer administered questionnaire where it's done through a telephone and the researcher records the respondent's answer over the telephone. When do we use a survey questionnaire? These are effective tool of data collection for a descriptive and explanatory studies. Descriptive studies is where we seek for opinions and attitude of respondents. Explanatory studies talks about relationship between variables. The advantages in the survey method is it's low cost even when the sample size is large, and they are spread throughout globally, widely spread. It's free from the bias of the interviewer, where the respondents can answer in their own words. They have adequate time to give well thought out answers. They have time to think. Then respondents who are not easily approachable can be approached here easily. Large samples can be actually made, right? And so the results can be made more dependable and much more reliable because you have more, the sample size is big. What are the disadvantages? It's high chance that your questionnaire may not be filled up and returned to you. There could be, that's what we say, bias due to no response. It could be quite high, yes, and it's often indeterminate. You do not know how many would respond, how many would not, and it's used only when respondents are educated and cooperating. The control over the questionnaire may get lost once it is sent. You don't have any control. There is an inbuilt inflexibility. Why? Because of the difficulty of amending the approach once the questionnaires have been dispatched, right? And there's also the possibility of ambiguous replies or omission of replies altogether to certain questions. Interpretation of omission is difficult. It's also difficult to know whether willing respondents are truly representative, right? And this method is actually the slowest of all the methods. Some of the tips to design a questionnaire: primarily ask close-ended questions. So depending on the survey size of your survey and your objectives, multiple choice and close-ended questions are the best. Why? Because open-ended questions requires more time for the participant to actually think and ask. So to this extent, what happens? Questions will cause your participants to actually abandon the survey without answering, right? So if possible, put your open-ended questions on in a separate group to the end of your survey question at the end. First start with closed-ended and towards the end, right? So ask neutral questions, right? Asking leading questions or putting your opinions in questions will influence the respondents. So instead of saying what your opinion, we think this is the best, but what do you think is the best? That would be much better. Keep the question answers balanced. So what we have to do is you have to find a way to provide a balanced and honest opinion. Otherwise, what happens? The credibility of the responses becomes dubious, right? So instead of, say, for instance, if you want to know the customer services, if you say only extremely helpful, very helpful, and helpful, the person may have a very bad idea, experience on the customer service. So you have to also include, it's called unhelpful, very unhelpful. So both ends. Only ask one thing at a time. Say, for instance, if you ask two things, two questions at a time in a question, that's bound to confuse your respondent. So, say, for instance, if you say, how do you rate the brand and performance of your car? These are two different things. So, ask separately. Okay. Do not force your participants to answer all the questions, right? Because some of the participants may find the answers difficult and may not want to answer the questions, right? So just you should not force them, right? You should test your questionnaire. So because untested questionnaire can be can be problematic, right? So it's better to correct your question error before you send it to your the how do you before you send it to your respondents. And how do you do it? You can ask your friends, family, colleagues to actually undertake that survey, give feedback. So use logic. Don't keep the participant answering irrelevant questions, right? Using images in your questions can actually help in getting the message across much in a better way. Keep the survey short. Okay, attempt to keep your survey short as possible by combining questions and data points. So, good survey requires good planning, good questions, and thoughtful answer choices. The better you write your survey, then the better your respondents will be. Internet and internet mediated interviewing. So what is it? It's basically where it refers to interviews which are held both in real time using internet and organizations internet, as well as that are in effect undertaken offline. So it's asynchronous and synchronous. Okay, so which offers a useful way of categorizing electronic interviews, as there are different significant differences in electronic interviews depending on whether the interview is taken in real time or offline, right? So what happens is when we do, one of the main common way of doing interviewing is could be the chat room, that is in where we have the messenger, right? So some would argue that this is not a very effective, not a true chat room, because conversations are restricted to those who are in the users list, right? So it can be said. And some researchers have also argue that interviewing participants online through web conferencing or chats is unlikely to achieve the same levels of interaction and spontaneous communication that can be obtained with face-to-face interviewing. You're up there, right? So could be because of the bandwidth of the electronic media that we have as compared to the face-to-face communication, right? Okay. So, asynchronous interview could be like or asynchronous interviewing. That is where we have mail, internet forums, discussion groups. What happens? Interviews are conducted normally over an extended period of time or weeks, right? And in forums, what happens is like where discussion happens, and they do not allow people to edit each other's messages, and there is a moderator who's up there, right? In case of an asynchronous interview that happens. But in case of a synchronous interview where you have basically a chat, and there everyone can edit answers, they can see each other's answers, and that's much more effective, right? Okay, so these are the websites which talks to you about the various types of how to design various types of questionnaire. You learn to get to know more about it and how to design a questionnaire. Okay, next, types of variable. First is opinion. There are three types of variable that you have. One is opinion, where it talks about how respondents feel about something or what they think or believe is true or false. Behavioral variable, it contains data on what people did in the past, do now, or will do in the future. Attribute variables, where it asks the respondent's characteristics. Characteristics like age, gender, marital status, education, occupation, income. So this is an example of the different types of variable that we have. Okay, so again, the different investigative questions, the variables, details. So this is for you as an exercise. Okay, right. Now, how do you measure variables? When we say measurement, it's the assignment of numbers or other symbols to characteristics or attributes of objects according to a pre-specified set of rules. Objects here means who? It could be persons, strategic business units, companies, countries, bicycles, elephants, and so on and so forth. Characteristics of objects, it's arousal seeking tendency, achievement, motivation, effectiveness, enjoyment, and so on and so forth. Attributes of objects that can be physically measured by some calibrated instruments pose no measurement problems. Okay, say for instance, if you want to measure the length and width of a table, so and it can be done easily with a measuring tape or ruler. Data representing geographical demographic characteristics of employees are easily, how do you obtain that? It's easily obtained by asking employees questions, right? Abstract and subjective variables, they are harder to measure, where we talk of motivation, effectiveness, it's difficult to measure. So the levels of scale measurement, we have a nominal, which is attributes are only named. Ordinal, where it can be ordered, and interval, the distance is meaningful, ratio, absolute zero. So scale, when we talk of scale, what is it? It's a tool or mechanism by which individuals are distinguished as to how they differ from one another on the variables of interest of study. Okay, so see this, when we nominal, it's just your position, just by yourself. Ordinal is where you show the positions. Interval is where you talk of the gap. And ratio is absolute zero, where we talk of, say, 1 minute 59 2/5 second for 1.14 miles. You're measuring it, time and the miles. So, nominal scale, it places data into categories with no order, and it's often uses for names or numbers with no numerical value, like male, female, unemployed, employed. It's from statistical point of viewpoint, it's the lowest form of measurement, right? This is an example. Ordinal scale, it allows things to be arranged based on how much of some concept they possess, right? So it allows researchers also to identify the order of a factor without relative positional distances, like who is more superior to the second. That's how it's done. So see this? Interval scale, it has both nominal and ordinal properties, right? And captures information about differences in quantities of a concept. So reveal order as well as intervals. See this? 1 Celsius here is equal to 1 Celsius there, the interval. Ratio is that properties of interval scales with the additional attribute of representing absolute quantities. Scale that has a true 0 point. It's not commonly used or found in social research. For example, time, measuring reaction time in milliseconds. So these are some of the activities regarding nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. Now, measuring, when we talk of measuring attitudes, so attitude, what is attitude? It's an enduring disposition to consistently respond in a given manner to different aspects, various aspects of the world, right? There are three different components of attitude. One is cognition, when knowledge and beliefs about an object, situation, or person. Affect comes the feelings or emotions towards an object, situation, or person. Behavior is it's predisposition to action, intentions, behavioral expectations. So, why do we measure attitudes? Now, most managers hold the belief that changing consumers' or employees' attitudes towards their company or their company's products, services is a major goal. And it's important task. Why? Because modifying attitudes, it plays a pervasive role in developing strategies to address these goals. Now, how to measure attitudes? First is ranking, which requires the respondent to rank order objects in overall performance on the basis of a characteristic or stimulus. Rating, where you're asking the respondents to estimate the magnitude of a characteristic or quality that an object possesses by indicating on a scale where he or she would rate an object. Now, sorting, third, is presenting the respondent with several concepts typed on cards and requiring the respondent to arrange the cards into a number of piles or otherwise classify the concepts. And choice is asking the respondent to choose one alternative from among several alternatives. It's assumed that the chosen alternative is preferred over the others. So, attitude rating scales, simple attitude scale, which requires an individual to agree or disagree with a statement or respondent to a simple question, which basically classifies respondents into one or two categories, that is, yes or no. Right? This is an example. Category scale, it's a more sensitive method than a simple scale where it can have more than two responses. Right? See this? More than two. Method of summated ratings. Likert scale is a very popular method of measuring attitudes. Respondents indicate their own attitudes by checking how strongly they agree or disagree with statements. And some of the typical alternatives could be strongly agree, agree, certain, uncertain, disagree, strongly disagree. Semantic differential scale, it's a series of 7-point rating scales with bipolar adjectives such as good, bad, anchoring the ends of poles of the scale, right? So weight is assigned to each position. Traditionally, the score starts from 7 and goes to, say, it can 7 to 1 or +3 to -3. This is an example. Okay, there can be other rating scales also. So one is geographical scale, which is a measure of attitude that allows respondents to rate an object by choosing any point on a graphic continuum, right? See, allows a researcher to choose any interval desired for scoring purposes, worst possible, best possible. So next comes up is where we talk of designing the questionnaire. How you can adopt questions used in other questionnaire. So researchers can adopt questions which are used in other studies when he or she wants to replicate the findings with another study, right? While the method can be effective and efficient, as such, these sort of questionnaire are already tested for validity and reliability. But there is also the possibility that there are also many poor questions in circulation. You can use it because it has already been tested. It's been tested for validity and reliability, but there can be poor questions, so you have to be very careful, right? Your minor research questions should determine the survey questions, deciding the nature of the questions. That is when you're this is when we are talking a questionnaire. It could be open-ended or close-ended. Wording should be similar, very simple, sorry, not similar. There should be pilot testing done on the questionnaire, right, to actually refine the questions to reduce errors also. Checking for validity, which involves the panel of experts and testing. Are the questions measuring what you intend to measure? Do they cover all your contents? Is it appropriate for your sample? And did you use appropriate measurement or instrument, as we say? Checking for reliability, it refers to the extent that if all your questions determine the same results, it should be able to explain different concepts and constructs in your study. Pilot testing can ensure consistency in the questions. Next type of tool that we have is case studies, which is very popular form of qualitative analysis, which involves a careful and complete observation of a social unit, be that unit could be a person, family, institution, culture group, or even an entire community, right? Where you can have an in-depth study. It places more emphasis on the full analysis for a limited number of events or conditions and their interrelations, right? It deals with the processes that take place and their interrelationship. So it's basically an intensive investigation of a particular unit under consideration. What is the main objective in this method? To locate the factors that account for the behavior patterns of a given unit as an integrated totality. Okay. So we have different types of the definitions given by different group of people. Some of the characteristics. So what happens? Researcher can take one single unit or more such units for his purpose of study. And here the selected study unit is studied intensively. And in the context of this method, what happens is we make complete study of the social unit covering all the facets. Here, the approach that happens to be qualitative and not quantitative, right? Where we want more like why, not just the data, right? And here, what happens is in this method, an effort is made to know the mutual interrelationship of causal factors. Also, the behavioral pattern of the concerning unit is studied indirectly, not by indirect and abstract approach. It results in fruitful hypotheses along with the data which may be helpful in testing them, right? Evolution and scope. So it has been used widely in systematic field, and it's used widely, and it's used in a systematic way, and it's generally used mostly in sociology these days, right? And it's the first person who started with goes to Frederick Lipley. Like he was the first person who spoke about it. Assumptions. The case study method is based on several assumptions. One, the assumption of uniformity in the basic human nature, in spite of the fact that human behavior may vary according to situations. The assumption of studying the natural history of the units concerned, and the assumption of comprehensive study of the units concerned. So these are the assumptions made. The major phases which are involved here is first to recognize and determine the status of the phenomenon that you want to investigate, then collect data, examine and history of the given phenomena, diagnosis and identification of the causal factors, which forms a basis for the remedial measures. Then application, once you come up with the remedial measures, how to apply your application, right? And then comes up the follow-up method, follow-up program to see the effectiveness of the treatment applied. So there are some advantages for case study. What happens? It enables us to understand fully the behavioral pattern of the concerned units, and the researcher can obtain a real and enlightened record of personal experience, which would reveal a person's inner feelings, strivings, tensions, motivations, which actually forced him to, or drove him to behave in such a way. Okay, so you get to know the behavioral pattern. It also helps the researcher to trace out the natural history of the social unit and its relationship with the social factors and the other surrounding factors. Helps in formulating relevant hypotheses along with the data, which may be useful in testing them. It helps in intensive study of social units, which is generally not possible if we use either observation method or collecting information through schedules. Information collected helps a lot of researcher in the task of constructing the right kind of questionnaire or schedule. The researcher can use one or more of several research methods in case of case study, depending on the circumstances. It's also proved beneficial in determining the nature of units to be studied along with the nature of universe. It is also this is used to understand the past of a social unit, past behavior pattern, and it is case studies also constitute the perfect type of sociological material because they represent a real record of personal experiences, right? Which very often escape the attention of most of skilled researchers, right? It enhances the experience of researcher, which helps in turn to increase his analyzing ability and skill. This method also makes possible the study of social changes. It can happens. In case of case study techniques, they are also indispensable for therapeutic and administrative purpose. They are also of immense value in taking decisions in several management problems. What are the drawbacks? It are in case of case studies, they are seldom comparable. Why? It cannot be replicated, right? You cannot compare it. So what has happened? The case studies in the is real. In case of case studies, real information is often not collected because the subjectivity of the researcher does enter in the collection of information. How you perceive it as a researcher, the danger of false generalization is always there, right? Because there are no set rules followed in collecting information, and only few units are studied. It takes time and requires a lot of expenditure. Okay, and it's often very often also vitiated because what happens because the subject may write what he thinks the researcher wants. Better the rapport, the subject, the more subject the whole process is. Its case study is also based on assumptions which may not be realistic at times, and as such the usefulness of the data is always subject to doubt. It can be used only in a limited sphere, cannot be used in a big society, right? Sampling is also not possible in case of case study method. Response of the investigator, what happens? He, in case of the response, he or she thinks that he has full knowledge about the unit and can himself answer about it. In case the same is not true, then consequences will always follow. You can, so then the results also becomes which is inaccurate. Okay. Next is focus groups, right? Focus group. What is focus group? Is focus group is also called a focus group interview. It's a group interview that focuses clearly on a particular issue, product, service, or topic, and encompasses the need for interactive discussion amongst all the participants, which means here, what happens is individual group members interact and responses are both encouraged. So they interact and they should also respond, and that is encouraged, which is closely monitored and controlled to maintain their focus on the topic, right? When these participants are selected, why? Because they have certain characteristics in common and that relate to the topic being discussed. They're being encouraged to discuss and share their points of view without any pressure to reach a consensus. Okay, right. So when focus groups are being used, it is likely to be associated with a higher level of interviewer-led structure, and intervention is needed to facilitate discussion and- as compared to group interviews. And the size of the groups may also be related to the topic here. You may like you can have a smaller group, or you can talk of a bigger group depending on the subject. Next type of primary data collection tool is observation, right? It's usually somewhat neglected in case of research, but yet it can be rewarding and enlightening also for to pursue, and it can actually help to the richness of your research data, right? If your research questions and objectives are concerned with what people do, obvious way is to watch them, right? This is exactly what observation method talks of. The systematic observation, recording, description, and analysis of interpretation of people's behavior. That's how you do it. So there are two types of observation techniques. One is participant observation, which is qualitative and derives from the work of social anthropology, right? It started from anthropology. It emphasizes on discovering the meanings that people attach to their actions. Why do they do it? The other type is structured observation, which is quantitative and is more concerned with the frequency of those observations. How many times do they do it? One is the reason, the other is more that's qualitative, and quantitative is structured, which is how many times, the frequency of doing it. So in case of participant observation, right, here the researcher attempts to participate fully in the lives and activities of the subjects and thus becomes a member of the group, organization, or community. You as a researcher, you actively get involved with your respondents, and which helps you in sharing their experience, right? You can by not merely observing what is happening, but you're also feeling it, right? Okay. So these are the different definitions that we have. But what happens? You can actually be a participant. Well, whether you want to be an active participant or whether you want to be a observer, it depends on your topic. It depends on your research or your project topic. Okay, so you can be, there are four different roles that you can play. One is being a complete participant, where you see your role is to you see yourself as becoming a member of the group in which you are performing research. You do not reveal the true purpose to the group members. You may be able to justify this role on pure research grounds, right? So, say if you want to observe the hidden habits of employees in an organization, you're also part of it, and you get also sit with them and you get to know it, why they have that particular habit. Complete observer, here also you do not reveal your true purpose of activity to those who are observing, but you do not take part in their activity. You are observing. Say what happens. Say if you're studying the consumer behavior in supermarkets. Third type is observer as participants, where you can adopt the role of an observer as participant in an outward bound course to help in assisting team building. If you're attending to observe without taking part in the activities in the same way as real candidates, you are helping them, you're guiding, assisting them for team building. So, but you don't take part in their activities. So here you are a spectator, right? So, but here what happens, your identity as a researcher is known, is you make it clear to everyone, right? So people get to know, wow, what is your purpose, they get to know about it. Participant as observer, here what happens, you reveal your purpose as a researcher. Both you and the subjects are aware of the fact that it is a fieldwork relationship. Yeah, so you are particularly interested to gain the trust of the group. If you gain their trust, then it becomes easy to understand their behavioral pattern. You can ask questions and to get more answers, right? So, what are the factors that will determine the choice of participant observer role? Definitely, as I said, the purpose of your research, the time you have to devote to your research, the degree to which you feel suited to participant observation, organizational access, your access with that organization, and ethical considerations also comes into play. Ethics plays a big role. The participant observation, in case of participant observation, how do you collect data? It can be primary observations, where you would note what happened or what was said at that time, right? It's best to keep a diary. Secondary observations are statements by observers of what happened or what was said. It's not you noting, but the observers, they are saying what has happened and what was said, their interpretation. And the third type is experiment data, which is data which are those data on your perceptions and feelings when you experience the process that you're researching. So your feelings comes, your perceptions comes up. The other type of observation is structured observation, which is systematic and has a high level of predetermined structure. Here, what happens, if you use this method for data collection, you will be adopting a more detached stance. You do not get involved, you just see, right? Your concern would be in quantifying behavior. So it may form a part of your data collection, because its function is to tell you how often things are happening rather than why they are happening, right? So you to collect data, we use coding schedules when we talk of structured observation, right? Which is coding schedule is also called, as we say, is off the shelf coding schedule, or here, yes, off the scale coding schedule, or as we say, is design your own. So you design your own questions, and the question research, this would depend upon your research questions and the objectives. And there are a number of questions you should ask yourself when you are actually choosing off the shelf coding schedule. So Generally, like questions to ask when you ask using this method is, for what purpose was the coding schedule developed, right? Is it consistent with your research questions and objectives? Is there overlap between the behaviors to be observed? Are the behaviors in which you are interested covered by the schedule? Are the behaviors sufficiently clearly specified so that all the observers will place behaviors in the same category? Is there observer interpretation necessary? Are the codes to be used indicating or on the recording form to avoid the necessity of memorization by the observer? These are some of the common questions that is usually put when you go for this method. Will the behaviors to be observed be relevant to the inferences that you make? Have all the sources of a behavior bias being eliminated? What are the advantages that you have? It can be used by anyone after suitable training in the use of measuring instrument, right? So what also happens is it actually helps to yield a high reliable results by virtue of its replicability. It is capable of more than simply observing the frequency of events. So for example, is say if you talk of this is a question, is the visit to the retail chemist counter to present a prescription preceded by an examination of merchandise unrelated to prescription transaction, right? So this is one of the example. This method actually allows the collection of data at the time they occur in their natural setting. So you do not have to depend on second-hand accounts of phenomenon for respondents firsthand. So it also secures information that most participants would ignore because to them it is irrelevant. So you get to know all these by through observation, get to know about get data which otherwise people think it's not so important. People don't pay much attention. What are the drawbacks? It must be used. The observer must be that you when you're using it. The observer must be in the research setting when the phenomenon under study takes place. Has to be physically present. Your observers. Otherwise, it's difficult. The results are limited to overt action or surface indicators from which the observer must make inferences. Right? Data collection is slow and expensive to collect. And one of the most frequent uses of establishing coding schedules in management and business is for recording interpersonal interaction in social situations, such as meetings or negotiations. So, which helps to have lead to structured observation particularly well. Okay, when you have an informal setting, how people react. Next is the secondary method of data collection, right? So what is it? Use of data, as I said, secondary method, use of data which is already available and analyzing to answer the researcher's questions. Specific research questions, that is RQ, and RQ stands for research questions and objective. It includes both raw data and published summaries. Depending upon who is producing the data, such publication may be online, print media, or the organization records. Types of secondary data, it could be documentary secondary data, survey-based secondary data, multiple source secondary data. Documentary-based secondary data includes notices, minutes of meeting, reports to shareholders, diaries, transcripts of speeches, administrative and public records, journals, newspapers, magazines, or sometimes voice and video recordings, pictures, drawings, films, TV programs, right, which can be analyzed both quantitatively and qualitatively. Next is survey-based secondary data, which is collected through survey questionnaires that have already been analyzed. Now, this data comes either in raw form or qualified or compiled data tables collected by census, continuous or regular survey, or ad hoc surveys. Government usually does surveys to collect data mainly for economic analysis, right? So where they have make it compulsory that every person has to participate in it. So which becomes a what? It's a census strategy. Survey-based secondary data, what happens as we were just talking about it. So here, government survey reports can provide us a lot of information as they cover the whole population, well-defined facts and easily accessible. Surveys that are repeatedly carried out is called continuous or regular survey, and there can be ad hoc surveys also, which comes generally when they are carried out by independent researchers. Now, third type of secondary data is multiple source secondary data, where we use different sets of information to form a data set, right? Compilation of data of different companies or countries. But here the researcher has to be careful on evaluating these sort of data. Why? Because as every data may not be relevant for fulfilling the objective of their study. Example of multiple source secondary data is a list of companies in Europe ranked by sales, profits, and number of employees, share price listing of different stock markets. Next type of secondary data collection tool is data mining, which is a process that converts raw data into useful information. The software is used to mine huge amounts of data in search of patterns that communicate insights to business owners. And these are unlikely to be observed or extracted without the help of mining software. Why? Because the data collection is too big for an individual to sift through. If you cannot do it manually, so you need to have a software which can actually use it. And with data mining, what happens? The businesses can know more about their customers, and they can come up with more better marketing strategies for increasing sales, decreasing costs. So there are 5 data mining techniques that you have. What are they? Analysis, association, rule learning, anomaly, regression analysis. Okay. So first comes up is when we talk of there are the classification analysis. First is we talk of association rule learning, right? Before we go to association rule learning, let's talk of classification analysis, where the data is segmented into assigned categories and then applies pre-established algorithms to mine those segments for particular extractions. It helps us in determining how to best classify data. Association rule learning. So here what happens, it informs users of relationship within data, which is it's very much beneficial in understanding consumer behavior. Anomaly detects outlier performance. Outlier performs the patterns, the behavior and relationship patterns that occur outside of predicted or previously observed patterns. So it's outside, like it's not your normal behavior, right? So fourth is when we talk of regression analysis. Regression analysis is used to produce and forecast consumer behavior, right? So it helps in identifying variables amongst relationships, whether they are independent or dependent, right? So, but whichever technique you choose, it depends on which perspective you're analyzing your data. Depends on that. So next comes up is next tool is content analysis. Content analysis, it is used to identify patterns in recorded communication, right? So to conduct a content analysis, what we have to do is we have to systematically collect data from a set of texts, which can be written, oral or visual, books like books, newspapers, magazines, speeches, interviews, web content, social media posts, photographs, films. It can be both quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative will be counting and measuring, qualitative is interpreting, understanding. But in both these types, you categorize or code words, themes, or concepts within the text and then analyze the results. Look into what it is mainly about. So, what is it? What is content analysis used for? To find out about the purpose, message, and the effects of the communication content. You can also use to make inferences about the producers and audiences of the text they analyze. It can be used to quantify the occurrence of certain words, phrases, subjects, or concepts in a set of historical or contemporary contexts. Quantitative content analysis example, right? Example is to research the importance of unemployment issues in political campaigns. You could analyze campaign speeches or the frequency of terms such as unemployment, jobs, and work, right? Qualitative content analysis example, to gain a more qualitative understanding of employment issues in political campaigns, you can look at the words unemployment in speeches, identify what other words or phrases appear to it, and analyze the meanings of these relationships. Now, because content analysis can be applied to a broader range of text, it is used in a variety of fields like marketing, media, anthropology, cognitive science, psychology, and other social disciplines. And it has various goals. First, to find the correlations and patterns in how concepts are communicated, understand the intentions of an individual group or institution, identify propaganda and bias in communication, revealing differences in communication in different contexts, analyzing the consequences of the communication content, such as the flow of information or audience responses. So, first comes up is to find the relationship and amongst the concepts and the patterns. Whereas with regards to how they are communicated, these concepts, you need to understand the intention of the group on the study, identify the propaganda and the biasness in when communication is happening, the differences in communication in different contexts, and the consequences of the communication content, right? Such as flow of information, or the audience responses. What advantages of content analysis? Unobtrusive data collection. You can always analyze communication and social interaction without the direct involvement of participants. So what happens? Your presence as a researcher does not influence the result, right? Because you're not it doesn't affect whether you're present, so it's already done, these things are done. So it doesn't affect the respondents and the study. Transparent and replicable. If it is done properly, content analysis allows a systematic procedure that can easily be replicated by other researchers, which would help in the coming up with results which is with higher reliability. Highly flexible. You can conduct this type of this type of research, like you can use this content analysis method, this type of method, in any location and at low cost, right? And all that you need is to have access to the appropriate sources. You can do it anywhere. So, what are the drawbacks? Reductive. Focusing on certain words and phrases in isolation can sometimes be overly reductive. Like what happens? You are disregarding some context, the nuance, and ambiguous meaning. So you just your eyes are focusing on these words or phrases in isolation. Subjective. It can always, in most cases, it involves some level of subjective interpretation, our own interpretation. How do we perceive it, right? Which can affect the reliability and validity of the results and conclusions. It's subjective, it's not objective. Everyone will not come up with the same answer. It's time intensive. Why? Manually coding large volumes of text is extremely time consuming, right? And it is very difficult to automate it. You cannot do it. You have to go for manual thing. How do we conduct a content analysis? When you use content analysis in your research, you need to start with a clear, direct research question. So, for example, if you have a question, is there difference in how US media represents male and female politicians in terms of trustworthiness? So, what are the next things that you do? You have to conduct 5 steps. Select the content you will analyze. So, based on your research questions, choose text that you will analyze. You need to decide the medium, the criteria for inclusion, the parameters in terms of date, range, location, etc. If there are any if there are only a small volume of text that meet your criteria, you might analyze them, right? If there are large text, then you have to select a sample. Then to research media representations of male and female politicians, you need to analyze news articles, opinion pieces, and so forth. Next, the second step is to define the units and categories of analysis, right? So, which means what? When the units of meaning that will be coded. For example, are you going to record the frequency of individual words or phrases, characteristics of people who produced or appear in the text, their presence and position of images, or the treatment of the concepts or themes, right? So the set of categories that you will be used for coding, that's also there. Categories could be objective categories, that is female, aged, right, age group, their type of occupation, or more conceptual. It could be objective or could be more conceptual, that is trustworthy, corrupt, conservative, family oriented. This is with regards to the example that I've given, right? Third stage is to develop a set of rules for coding. Coding involves organizing the units of meaningful into a previously defined categories, right? And it's important. Why? Because it is you need to clearly define the rules for what will and won't be included to ensure that all your texts are coded consistently, right? And these coding rules are important if multiple research are involved, right? Because then everyone is on the same page, right? As per the rules they would go about. So your method becomes, it makes helps, these rules helps in making your method more reliable and more transparent, right? Fourth stage is coding the text according to the rules. So you can go through each text and record all relevant data and the appropriate categories, right? Okay, so either you can do it manually or using some computer programs like QSR, NNivo, Atlas D Diction, which helps in speeding up the process. And the last one is where you analyze the results and draw a conclusion. Once your coding is done, so the complete data is examined to find patterns and draw conclusions in response to your research question. So you can use statistical analysis to find correlations, trends, discuss your interpretations of what the results mean, make inferences about characters, context, and audience of the text, right? Okay, the next tool is experimentation method. Here what happens is researchers identify and define key variables, formulate a hypothesis, manipulate the variables and collect data on the results. Extraneous variables are carefully controlled to minimize a potential impact on the outcome of the experiment, right? Here what happens is you as a researcher, you can change some variables and observe their effect on other variables. What happens if you can change? So the variables that you manipulate are independent, and while the variables that change as a result of this manipulation is dependent, right? So example is if you are as a manufacturer, you're testing the effect of drug strength on a number of bacteria in the body. So what happens? The company decides to test the drug strength at 10 mg, 20 mg, 40 mg. So in this example, the drug strength is independent variable because we are changing from 10 to 20 to 40, while the number of bacteria is independent variable. Okay, so the drug administered is the treatment, while 10, 20, and 40 are the levels of treatment. The biggest advantage of using experimentation method is that you can explore causal relationship, which an observational study under observational study you cannot do so. Additionally, also this method can be used to different fields like medical research, agriculture, sociology, psychology, and also whatever way, whichever field you use. Experiments also have there is a disadvantage, that is it's quite expensive and it requires a lot of time. So when we talk of data collection, what do we need to know? First thing is the type or source of data, right? The reporting study. Here in data collection, we are talking of, if we say secondary source, when we have descriptive study, it's secondary and primary. When we talk of explanatory study, it's primary, secondary, and primary. Predictive study is secondary and primary. Methods of data collection under reporting is observation. Descriptive study is survey, questionnaire, structured interviews. For explanatory study, it's survey questionnaire with open-ended questions, and in-depth interviews to validate your findings. Predictive study is open-ended survey or in-depth interview, observation for a longer period of time. Okay. For data analysis, when you have data analysis in reporting study, it's qualitative or quantitative analysis. For descriptive study, it's quantitative analysis. For explanatory study, it's mixed methods. For predictive, it's qualitative or mixed methods. So this table is very important. Depending on the type of study, you will choose the type of data source, methods of data collection, and data analysis. This will help you when you do your project or your research, right? So the advantages of, say, using secondary data, you may have fewer resource requirements, the higher quality data. Longitudinal studies are feasible. Longitudinal, over a long span of time, you can go on studying, right? It provides you with comparative as well as contextual data. It can lead to unforeseen new discoveries. It is permanent and available at any time. But the drawback here is the relevancy of data to current study, because it was collected by someone for their purpose. Difficulty in accessing the data is difficult. Reliability of the data is there, and initial purposes may affect how data are presented. So, this is the last thing that we have is when we talk of measurement of variables. See, this is where we have it, right? Purpose of study, extent of research or interference study, research strategies. This is the measurement. We have the data analysis using different methods, right? Okay, so that's all that we have up here for you. And if you have any questions, please let me know in class. Okay, see you in class next week.